Hello, I am Paul O'D of the MMA Opinion, and I'm joined on the line today by Nate Quarry. How are you doing, Nate?
I'm awesome. Thank you.
Very good. Now, most people will remember Nate as the fighter. You're most synonymous with The Ultimate Fighter, the original series of The Ultimate Fighter.
The
Um,
best season ever.
the best season ever, and
All downhill from there.
the resurgence of MMA in a sense. But
Very, very true.
and then for fighting Rich Franklin, which isn't exactly probably one of your most notable moments in MMA either.
Nobody remembers that. That never comes up.
But these days, I suppose you're more likely to see Nate at a Comic-Con than you are to see him at a fighter convention. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that, Nate?
That's a good segue. Yes. I grew up as just an old school nerd. I kind of escaped my unfortunate childhood into the world of comic books. Marvel was always kind of my way. And then finding the Ultimate Fighter, finding MMA, and kind of making my way through that world. Fighting for me, it really saved me in a lot of ways. It gave me an outlet for my aggression in a positive way. Gave me some self-esteem, some way to believe in myself. Well, when people started asking me about writing a biography, I didn't want
Yeah.
to do the usual Rocky story. It's been done so many times.
Yeah.
So I wrote about what I've been through, what I've seen and done as a fighter, and at the time as a single father. And then I threw in zombies. So this is the autobiographical horror story of my life, Zombie Cage Fighter, that you can see behind me or right here.
Product placement at its finest.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted to just to share my story and do it with a little bit of flavor, and
Yeah.
that's where the zombies came in. And as I was writing this, I originally the idea came from after practice, and every gym kind of has its own feel. The gyms that I've trained at have been mostly nerdy type people, and jujitsu guys are the nerds of the martial
Yeah.
arts world, to be clear. So we'd be sitting around talking about random comic books or movies or whatever. And I started thinking, how would an MMA fighter do in that world? He's not going to be able to beat up Spider-Man or Superman. What
Yeah.
about more of the horror genre? Well, it's going to be really tough to take on a vampire or a werewolf or something. But I started leaning towards the zombie aspect because I felt like a fighter facing off against a zombie, that's something I could handle.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to knock him out. They're not going to tap out, but they're basically just a machine. And so you have to
Yeah.
break down the mechanism. So if you kick a zombie in the leg and you break the thigh, well, then he has to crawl after you. If you can break its neck, he may still be chomping at you, but he's not chasing you.
Yeah.
And not to give away too much of the story, but it begins with so in my career, I did okay. I won some big fights. I lost some big fights. I feel like I did well for myself, especially coming from my background. Well, in the zombie cage fighting world, I'm kind of that cautionary tale where I never quite make it over the hump.
Yeah.
I'm still fighting in the small shows, way past my prime. And the promoter even tells me, he's like, look, man, no one's excited to see you on the card anymore. If
Yeah.
anything, they're a little bit sad. They're depressed. You should have quit years ago. And my response is, but I'm a fighter. This is what I do. This is all I know. And the promoter says, well, not for me.
Yeah.
And as I'm leaving the venue, I run into an old friend who happens to be putting on these underground shows, these zombie cage fights. Now, every movie you've ever seen about zombies, it's always post apocalypse.
Yeah.
There's a handful of humans and a billion zombies, and humans are trying to survive. Well, in the zombie cage fighting world, there's this I don't know if you can picture this, but this pandemic that's kind of going around the world that some people are denying, some people believe. Uh, and the government's not really doing that great of a job to really kind of put it down. So the promoter, some of these leaning towards evil people, well, as most promoters are generally, they start putting on these underground zombie cage fights. And for an old washed up fighter like myself, it's an opportunity to get back in the cage and hopefully make enough money that I can get my little girl out of the bad neighborhood, get her away from what's potentially going to be this major outbreak. And so the story, zombie cage fighter, if you take away the zombies, if you take away the cage fighting, it's really the story of a father trying to take care of his little girl when
Yeah.
every single dream he's ever had has died except for one, and that's just to make sure his little girl doesn't end up like him.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that because one of the taglines for the comic strip or the comic series is a washed-up fighter well past his prime, Nate Quarry, in the midst of a global pandemic, with one final dream to ensure that his little girl doesn't end up like him, broke and broken. Now, the first thing I'm going to ask is, are you a prophet of some sort? Because this came several years ago.
uh, I think it's just kind of reading the tea leaves, as it were.
Minus the zombies, of course. I mean, 2021 has been strange already. We're hoping not to go down that road.
I don't know. I see a lot of zombies on TV and a lot of certain news channels. I see a lot of people that have clearly checked out a long time ago that don't seem to be living in this world.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
And I suppose the second point on that, the like you say, the more cautionary tale behind it, and making sure that your daughter doesn't end up broken. Obviously, there's a lean towards kind of your past and your fighting career there, and I wouldn't say the bitterness of the kind of the payment scheme or everything that has happened since, but there is certainly a little nod to the acknowledgement of the fact that fighters are so much underpaid.
Very much so. Yeah, getting into our lawsuit that we have going on right now and the Ollie Expansion Act. Uh, when I started fighting half a lifetime ago, well, I started training when I was 24. I'm 48 now. Took my first fight at 26. There was 5 UFCs a year, I believe. There was next to no chance for someone like me making it into the UFC or one of the bigger shows. Myself, guys like Chris Leben, all those guys that were on season one of The Ultimate Fighter, we were fighting because we wanted to.
Yeah.
We had a passion for the sport. And I would always tell people, if you want to do this for money, fame, or women, go join a band.
Yeah.
It's way too hard. No one knows what this sport is, and it definitely doesn't pay. And right as I was getting ready to kind of retire from my MMA career and move on to something else, I had fought in Richmond, Virginia, defended my title out there the day after my father died. And it just so happens that this guy in the crowd came up to the ring after I beat my opponent in a pretty spectacular fashion. And he said, "Hey, I'm Joe Silva, the matchmaker for the UFC. We've got this thing called the Ultimate Fighter that we're going to be casting for, and I'm going to give you a call."
Yeah.
And it was kind of brought me back into that world and made it more of a realistic possibility. And then from there, of course, then the UFC completely blew up, and worldwide. What we've seen through our lawsuit is that the UFC on a bad year has made 94% of every MMA dollar spent worldwide in the big shows. On good years, 97, 98%.
The scary stat.
And Dana White said from the very beginning, while we were filming The Ultimate Fighter, they realized that they didn't have us all under contract. They only had the winners under. So Dana sat down with us and put down a contract and said, "Well, these are the contracts we want y'all to sign. We'll give you a contract in UFC if we believe you're worthy of it." And I was a little hesitant, and he said, "Well, but don't worry. If this thing takes off, don't worry. We'll take care of you."
Yeah.
And well, me being a man of my word, I assumed that everyone else is, and that's one of those life lessons you try to pick up as you get older. And even with the fact that as Randy Couture was standing right there with me and Chris Leben, as Dana White put this contract in front of us, all Randy would have had to say is, "I don't let my athletes sign anything without a lawyer looking at it first."
Yeah.
And what would Dana have done? We were halfway through the filming of the show. Are they going to throw away all these weeks and edit me and Leben out? No.
Yeah.
We would have had an actual point of negotiation for the first time, a point of power. But being completely naive and taking Dana at his word, I had no idea of that. And then we see the UFC just blow up and take over the world and shut down all these other organizations, from the WEC to Strikeforce to Pride, Affliction. The list goes on, as they became more and more a monopoly of the sport worldwide. And I started noticing that things were changing. It became more about the UFC, less about the fighters. Dana became more of a central figure towards the entire thing. And I think one of the big eye-opening moments for me was when I could always text Dana and ask him a question, or say, "Can I have this sponsor?" Blah blah blah. Well, all of a sudden, I no longer have his number, and I'm directed to go to the UFC office. And I asked a question one time, and I was told, no, we can't do that. That's against company policy. And I sat back and I went, company policy? Company policy, that it's three guys. It's a Fertitas and Dana White.
Yeah.
There's not this gigantic board that you have to run up the flagpole. He just says yes or no. But
Yeah.
apparently the answer moving forward is no.
Yeah.
And then more things happen with sponsors. I remember being told by the UFC, by Joe Silva, we can't pay you very much, but you can have whatever sponsors you want. Like, all right, well, that'll make up a little bit of difference. But then it was, well, we need to approve your sponsors first to make sure that they're not, something we don't want to be associated with. Then it was, well, you can't have any conflicting sponsors because we're signed with Harley Davidson. So you can't have Yamaha, Honda, Kawasaki, any other motorcycle company whatsoever. Then it became, well, now your sponsors, they need to be on their approved list. They have to pay the UFC $50,000 for the privilege of sponsoring you in the UFC. To which most of my sponsors were like, dude, we're on a shoestring budget here.
Yeah.
I was even signed with the And One basketball shoes. I was the first person to get a big shoe endorsement from a basketball shoe company.
And
after
they
this
wanted
one,
nothing to do with it after that, yeah.
and they flat out told me, like, we want to pay you. We want to support you on your journey, not the billionaire owners of this company. So it's just not in our budget. Sorry. And then the next year it went up to $100,000 for the privilege of sponsoring someone in the UFC. And then of course along came the Reebok deal, which Dana said was for the betterment of all the fighters. They don't have to deal with sponsors anymore, which from my perspective, this was how it would go. Sponsor would come up to me and say, hey, I want to pay you $5,000 to wear my shirt down for walkout. No, thank you.
Yeah.
That's it. That's how you deal with sponsors if you don't want to take their money.
Yeah.
And so the deal with Reebok, and I ended my career right about that time, I would have been paid $5,000 by Reebok for wearing only Reebok gear, as opposed to what I had been paid just the fight before of around $45,000. So I would have had a 90% pay cut. But this is what Dana said needed to be done because it's what's best for the sport, bring in this height. In reality, and Dana's actually said this on video, we keep our fighters starving, as hungry as much as we possibly can, so they'll fight anyone, anywhere, anytime, even if it's against their own best interest.
Yeah.
So for him as a promoter, his job is just to put on the best show possible. And as fighters, as every fighter that asks me for advice, I always say the same thing. You have to treat this like a business. Fight for the love of it. It's too hard not to. But
Yeah.
if you decide to stay in this game and keep going, you have to treat it like a business. Otherwise, you will be left broken at the end of your career.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that with guys like Spencer Fisher, who just came out with a huge article about all the damage he's done to his body and specifically his brain. He's got CTE, Parkinson's coming on him. The UFC essentially for years were paying him to be quiet.
Yeah.
And then the UFC sold the business and those payments stopped. And now you have someone who's completely broke and on his way to becoming completely broken. Doesn't remember what he had for breakfast.
Yeah.
Those are concerns for me. I think they should be concerns for everyone that's ever fought or is thinking about fighting. But and all this goes into our class action lawsuit where we believe that the UFC has illegally monopolized the sport. They've used coercive tactics to artificially control the wages. The things that the emails, the conversations we've seen through our discovery has just been horrific. How the UFC would treat these fighters, how they would even work with some managers behind the scenes to undercut the manager's own fighters.
Jesus.
So the manager could stay in good graces with the UFC and bring other
Of
fighters
course,
in
yeah.
while paying their own fighters less or getting less for them. It's an embarrassment. And along with the lawsuit, and Judge Boulwares just granted us class action certification, meaning the roughly 1,200 fighters or so that are in our lawsuit during our time period of around 7 years, that all of our stories are fairly similar. So we get to sue as one class against the UFC.
Yeah.
That was huge for us. Now that means that the UFC has to listen to us, that our suit has merit.
Yeah.
Combine that with the Ali Expansion Act. So for those that don't know, the Ali Act was passed a while back to provide protections for boxers from shady promoters. Promoters who will have an invested interest in a boxer, who will be paying that boxer more than someone else just to give them a better shot at winning. They'll
Yeah.
control the rankings. They're managing these fighters. They're hiding how much money they're making. They're requiring long-term contracts for these title shots. If you won't do it, well, then they just remove you from the rankings. All that changed with the Ali Act. It meant that no one promotion can become the monopoly of the sport of boxing. Well, MMA doesn't have that.
Yeah.
So the UFC has been able to monopolize the sport. If you want a title shot, if you knock everybody out, you're the number one seed. We can look at John Fitch, for example, number one contender for years and years, got one title shot
Yeah.
because they didn't like him. They didn't like his style. They didn't like his loud mouth, the way he spoke about the business things of it.
And
So
of
they
course,
just never
famously, they
gave
ended
him.
up cutting him. Yeah.
Yeah, they just never gave him another title shot. And one of the big things was when the UFC sent over this new contract saying, "Hey, everybody sign over all your likeness rights in perpetuity to us." Fitch said, "Hey, I'm not overly comfortable with this. Can I have a lawyer look at it?" And Dana came down and said, "Cool, you're out of the UFC, and we're cutting all of AKA American Kickboxing as well. Because
Jesus.
if you won't sign over everything, you're just dead to us."
Yeah.
And it took some. Lorenzo Fertitta had to get involved, and Fitch eventually just had to sign the contract as it was.
Yeah.
It's it's been insane. So about 4.5, 5 years ago, we were heading back to DC. Myself, John Fitch, quite a few others, Rob Macy, one of our lawyers that's been really a driving force in the lawsuit from the beginning. We would go back to DC to work on getting signers for our bill, HR 44, the Ali Expansion Act. And it's essentially the exact same bill or exact same law as the Ali Act. All it does is change the word from boxer to combatant.
Yeah.
And we had 58 signers of our bill. The original Ali Act had 16 signers of the bill, had more Democrats than Republicans, went to the vote, got signed into law. Awesome. We had 58 signers to our bill, more Republicans than Democrats this time around. We were told it was going to go to the floor for a vote, hopefully get signed right into law very quickly, moving forward. Then we had a change of occupancy of the White House, and Donald Trump took over. Donald Trump, who is famously good buddies with Dana White,
Yeah.
the person who will be most harmed by the Ali Expansion Act, because now he would have to allow the free market to bid on his fighters. If
Of course.
somebody has a title shot, and let's say we have the Bellator number one versus the UFC number one, they have to come together to make this fight. This is how sports works.
Yeah.
It's the best
And it
versus the
could in
best.
theory damage his brand, of course. Yeah.
Exactly. So Dana White, and we would see him going into the White House to meet with Donald Trump. We'd see Donald Trump at the UFC. All of a sudden, this bill that had 58 signers was killed in committee. We haven't seen hide nor hair of it since.
Yeah.
So
I
now that we're going to go back to someone else occupying the White House, we're going to be back to DC working on our signatures and get this passed into law.
Yeah, I do want to just go back to Judge Boulwares' certification and passing the antitrust lawsuit, because I believe that he ruled out the classification or the certification for the identity class, which would exclude, I believe, fighters such as yourselves who are in the antitrust for more of likeness reasons than because you weren't actually a participant during the late 2010 until 2017. Are you still heavily involved, knowing that this doesn't necessarily affect you and you might not become one of the plaintiffs down the road?
Short answer, yes. So my last fight in the UFC was, I think, March of 2010. Our lawsuit was allowed to start in, I think, December of 2010. So I was not in the bout class, as it's called. I was in the identity class.
Yeah.
Well, Judge Boulwares said that our stories are not necessarily similar enough between one another in the identity class that we could sue as a class action. Doesn't mean we weren't wrong. Doesn't mean there's not damages that we should pursue.
But it would have to be individually.
Exactly. However, I knew that from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And when I originally sat down with the lawyers, my first questions were, what's in it for you? What's in it for everybody else? What's in it for me? And the lawyers, they deserve to make their salary. They have families to feed as well. They're the ones that are working on this. The other fighters, they need to be compensated for the damages done. And what about myself and my family as well? And it was explained to me about the timeline, the statute of limitations, how I might spend years involved in this, which I have the past 5 years or so, 5 or 6, working on this, and then right at the end be kicked out. And I had to just say to myself, so am I doing this for myself, for my family, so I can get some justice, or am I doing this for the greater good and to change the sport moving forward? And I had to come to terms with that no, I could spend years working
Yeah,
on this, being a voice, speaking on this, and not get a dime at the end of it. And we'll see how it plays out. The lawyers, I think the fighters want to see me compensated for all of my efforts. But all along, I had to know that I'm doing this for the greater good. And that's just the way it has to be if that's how it plays out.
of course. And I suppose, look, famously, a lot of these have gone to settlement.
Mhm.
And if you look at some of the settlements, just based on studies of antitrust settlements, that there's a rough kind of estimate of 19% payout on the original asking price for it, which would mean that the 1,200 plaintiffs, or the slightly more than 1,200 plaintiffs, would be entitled, if they took the settlement, to close to $250,000 each, as opposed to if it went the full distance, they could be entitled to anywhere north of 1.2 million each. Um, do you think if they do settle, it damages your ability to get a settlement on your own behalf, or do you think if they follow through with this and they get and they win this antitrust case, that it helps your ability down the road to come at them as an individual for your likeness rights and be able to get a settlement from them?
Boy, that's a good question. And honestly, I've never even considered suing them as an individual for my likeness rights. I'm very content with the work that our team is doing
Yeah,
for the bout class. And I think if overall, if my plan is to see compensation for the fighters, this will do it much more than the identity class ever could have.
yeah,
And then we'll also be able to change the sport moving forward.
of course,
And
yeah,
now that the Democrats have the House, have the Senate, have the White House, and I assume Dana White's not going to be making a lot of trips to meet with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, we should
no,
be able to move forward with the All League Expansion Act. So I think the writing is somewhat on the wall now for the UFC. We've gotten our class certification. We have the branches of government as we need that will help pass the laws to help support the workers. I think if the UFC is smart, they're going to look to settle with us and make some changes as to the way that they do business
yeah,
so they can get out ahead of the All League Expansion Act and say, no, we support fighters' rights, whether they do or not. It's inconsequential, but that will be their marketing and say, no, we're going to set the stage here to move forward and take care of our fighters, blah, blah, blah.
yeah,
Otherwise, no, they just won't be able to compete moving forward. And I always refer to the greatest heavyweight fight we never saw, Randy Couture versus Fedor Emelianenko, because Mark Cuban wanted to put on that fight, and he couldn't make it happen because the UFC had tied up Randy, held
yeah,
him up in lawsuits, was bleeding him dry, and Fedor wasn't going to sign over to the UFC, give away all his rights and likenesses in perpetuity.
yeah,
So if Mark Cuban, one of the richest people on the planet, can't make a fight that everyone wants to see happen, what hope does any other small promoter have?
exactly. Yeah.
And the UFC can very likely stay in a very dominant position in the world of MMA. It just means now that they're going to have to compensate the fighters appropriately as the free market dictates them to.
Yeah, and if I'm to play devil's advocate for just one moment, the UFC obviously they've branded themselves as a sports league, but I think we all know deep down that it has always been a business, and they've always acted as a business. Now, coming from that angle, like the fact that they've been the ones really to drive the kind of the new wave of MMA, and they've created the sport, I suppose, what it is now. Don't get me wrong, there are some other fantastic promotions out there, and they've done an amazing job at trying to get up to a level to try and compete with the UFC. But as you said, 97% on a good year of the financial takings from MMA does go to the UFC. Do you think that this antitrust might, for some time, while it's changing the sport, that it might damage the sport?
No, I don't think so. I'm sure that there will be some growing pains as different promotions figure things out. But the UFC, if they want to maintain their position as the top dog, they're just going to have to start playing by the rules and
Yeah,
paying the fighters. it's and and this is what's so interesting to me. Every once in a while, Dana White, well, usually once a year, Dana White comes out with a statement that he's going to save boxing. He's going to bring it back to the forefront. He's going to start ultimate boxing or whatever the hell he calls it. And then a couple months later, he puts out another statement. No, boxing is broken. I can't save boxing. It's too fractured. Well, in reality, because he can't keep most of the money, he
Yeah.
doesn't want to get involved.
Yeah.
So what is that number? In the UFC, the promotion keeps roughly 85% of every dollar brought in. 15% goes to the athletes.
Yeah.
In boxing, it's the opposite. The boxers get 85% of the money, the promoter gets 15% of the money. So
Yeah.
Dana saying he can't work in boxing just means in reality, I won't take less than 85% of the money.
Yeah.
He could come in and he could be making millions upon millions, only taking 15% or 20% or whatever the market dictated in boxing, but he won't do that. Now, in MMA, I'm sure there's going to be someone that comes along and goes, wait, you guys are getting 85%, you're only paying the fighters 15?
Yeah.
Geez, I'll give them 20%.
Yeah.
I'll give them 30%. I'll double all of their salaries, and I'm still bringing home 70 cents out of every single dollar.
Yeah.
So you're going to have this free market capitalism that's going to come in and go, oh, wait a minute, you're making 10 million a show, and if I only make 5 million a show, I get the rights.
Yeah.
I'm more than happy to do that. It's going to be a nice restructuring. Yes, the UFC has done a lot of things for the sport of MMA, but at the same time, they've done a lot of things against them by killing the free market, by killing all of these other organizations and people, fighters that have earned title shots that never got them.
Yeah.
There was, I think it was our first, what was it called? The UFC Fighters Summit, where they would bring in all the fighters from around the world into Las Vegas and set us in a room for 2 days and tell us about marketing, how to handle yourself, blah blah blah, a bunch of nonsense. I avoided as much as I possibly could. But one day when I was sitting in there, and I forget which fighter it was that asked it because they were doing a question and answer, and it was Joe Silva and Dana White at the end of the day. And the fighter raised his hand and said, at what point are you going to do an actual ranking system so we can see who is deserving of the next title shot and do it just like boxing? And Dana White looked at him and said, I don't give a damn who you think is worth the next title shot. I put on the fights that the fans want to see that sell the pay-per-views. I don't care about that.
Yeah.
And that right there is just the ultimate slap in the face. Can you imagine any other sport doing that? The NFL saying, hey, Cleveland Browns, man, sorry, you're just not popular enough. Nobody wants to wear your gear. So we're going to give you a shot to, someplace out of New York or LA or something. It's what's best for the sport. That's what the fans want to see.
Yeah.
Well, then that's not sports.
Yeah.
That's entertainment. And if you have somebody who's fought and deserves this title shot and you don't give it to them for whatever the reason may be, well, again, that's not sports, that's entertainment.
Yeah. And look, just finally on this topic, I suppose going forward, what's the ideal result for you and the few fighters pursuing this? And the second part of this is, do you believe if this passes that it is the end of Dana White in the sport?
Well, our goal all along has been compensation for the years of injustice, the low pay that we've had been subjected to. And even someone like Spencer Fisher, he's a member in the class, so he would be compensated whether it goes to fruition or there's a settlement or whatever the case may be. So yeah, paying us for years of being taken advantage of, and then changing the sport moving forward, not requiring this never-ending contract to get a title shot. I think a lot of people, they're just so clueless about the way the UFC does business. You're never offered a title shot the last fight of your contract.
Yeah.
Because then you would be potentially a free agent and you would have the title. So the UFC just doesn't give you a title shot. Now, if you win the title and somehow your contract does run out, no, it never does, because you always have one more fight as long as you're the champion.
Yeah.
So not just compensation, but changing the sport moving forward. making it something where your hard work is actually recognized and realized. And yeah, that's it. And will this be the end of Dana White? I have no desire for this to be the end of Dana White. I have nothing against Dana personally.
Yeah.
Uh, as far as business wise, as much as I feel that I've been underpaid, taken advantage of in that way by the UFC and directly by Dana, it is what it is, and we're fighting to change that. Every sport has to go through this. In fact, every industry at one point has had to go through this. We used to not even have a minimum wage or fire exits. People had to fight for those changes. But Dana, when my back was hurting and I needed surgery, I couldn't afford to go to the doctor. I couldn't afford to get my surgery. He helped me find the surgeon. He helped me pay for my surgery.
Yeah.
So personally, I have nothing against Dana. Now, the flip side of that coin is if I had made more than $10,000 in my main event fight at the MGM Grand for the middleweight title, I could probably have afforded my own surgery, but it is what it is. So I personally have no issues with Dana or Joe Silva or the Fertitas, anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm for the workers, I'm for the fighters, and I want to see them get compensated appropriately.
Well, hopefully we get the result you're looking for, and hopefully it doesn't go on for another 6 years, and that we can get some kind of settlement soon enough for the fighters. I do want to just circle back briefly to Zombie Cage Fighter, if I can. Is it something that you might down the road look to option as a cartoon or for a TV series?
I would love to, and that's been my dream all along. Is I feel that the story is solid enough that it does really lend itself towards a movie, a series, a cartoon, whatever the case may be. It kind of got introduced to the world back in 2012 or 2013 on Kevin Smith's show, Comic Book Men.
Yeah.
And I had two guys actually dress up as Jay and Silent Bob and put on a cage match for Kevin Smith and Jason Mewes, who were there. And shortly after the filming of that, Kevin was sending me emails saying, "Hey, so what do you want to do with this story? You want to make a movie? What do you want to do?" And I said, "Yeah, man, I'm totally down to make a movie. You know, I'm here."
That's the man to make it as well, by the way.
Yeah. So for me, it really is my dream to see this come to life. And I think the biggest compliments I've always gotten about this were my own agent. When I sent him the original story, I'd sat down and wrote 22 pages of this, what became the comic book. I sent it to my own MMA agent, who we became great friends. He was in my wedding. Sent it to him, didn't hear anything back. Kept bugging him. Finally, 3 months later, I get a call from him, and he goes, "Dude, I got to tell you, I didn't want to read this because I knew it was gonna suck, and I didn't want to have to tell you." But he goes, "Oh my God, this is actually really good." I was like, "Thank you." So if I can win over my own agent,
yeah,
who has never told me what I want to hear in my entire career, I think that plays well for the success of Zombie Cage Fighter. And again, it really is. It has the glory of the MMA fights. It has the horror of the zombies, but at the core of it, it's just a father trying to take care of his little girl.
Yeah.
And there was times when I'm fighting in UFC and I had to bring my mortgage statement with me because I didn't have money to pay the bills. Literally fighting for food money, knowing if I lose this fight, we lose the house. I could get cut from the UFC. I lose all my sponsorships. And just fortunately, over and over again, I was able to kind of pull it out and keep moving forward. And I really enjoy telling this story through Zombie Cage Fighter and getting all of the excitement. And you even see behind me a statue there that a man by the name of Randy Bowen created. Randy Bowen is the #1 superhero sculptor in the world. You go into any comic book store around, you'll see his Spider-Man sculpture, his Hulk sculpture, anything like that. And we became friends over the years, and he ended up doing this for me. And we have a very limited number of them, and I put a few of them on the Kickstarter campaign.
Nice.
So for everybody that wants to get involved, go to zombiecagefighter.com, click on the Kickstarter link. You'll see that we've blown past our funding goal. But my goal all along was to be able to print as many copies as possible to get my story out there. Because right now I think we've sold around or had around 200 orders or so for the story. My goal all along has been 1,000. Because I want to know that 1,000 people are out there reading my story and hopefully enjoying it, hopefully escaping from what this horrific year has been into the world of Zombie Cage Fighter for a little bit.
That's perfect. And just to reiterate there, it is zombiecagefighter.com, and you can pick up the books, the Kickstarters there as well, and you also have some pretty cool apparel for the book series that's on there as well, just to show some support. Look, before I let you go, I do want to touch briefly on your fighting career. I suppose, being in the MMA podcast, we got to get into it a little bit.
Do it.
Was there any kind of looking back, what was the kind of pinnacle of your career? What you believe is kind of standout moment for you if you look back at your fighting career?
Well, I think everybody, and they kind of look back on their life, they can look at key days. And for me, my rematch against Pete Sell is probably, if not the most important day in my family's life. It's right up there.
Yeah.
Because what a struggle that was. I had fought 4 times in the UFC, won my first 3 fights by first round knockout. Then I get this title shot and it ends in a first round knockout, me being on the receiving end. And then 3 months later, I can't pick up my 5-year-old little girl because my back is hurting so bad. I need this very new back surgery, a spinal fusion. And I'm told by everyone, Joe Silva, even Pat Miletich, said, if you get back surgery, your career is over, your life is over, just live with the pain.
Yeah.
But it was so bad, I knew I could do nothing.
Yeah.
So I ended up getting the surgery, rehabbing, getting back in shape. Now I'm training at Team Quest, and Randy Couture had left Team Quest, and the whole vibe of the gym was completely different. Everyone was complaining, everyone was unhappy. So I end up leaving Team Quest. My daughter's mother sees me on TV, assumes I'm worth millions now, wants to go through this huge custody battle. So I'm fighting for my little girl. All the while I'm living on my credit card.
Yeah.
And 15 months after my back surgery, I step into the cage for a rematch against Pete Sell. In the first fight, I hit him with a straight left right on the jaw, dropped him, followed up with a big shot. His eyes rolled back in his head, and the referee, Cecil People, jumped on top of me and sandwiched me to Pete Sell. So Pete, and it's a flash knockdown.
Yeah.
He immediately, he's aware of what's going on. He's going, what are you doing on me? Get off of me. And I'm like, dude, I can't. I'm being held down here by Cecil Peoples. So then Pete jumps up and he goes, this is bullshit. They stopped the fight too early. And I'm sitting there going, man, I have nothing to do with it. I just came to fight. Well, now Pete wants a rematch and the UFC wants me to fight Pete. And I'm going, all right. So it's 22 months since my last fight where I got brutally knocked out. It's 15 months since my spinal fusion back surgery. I've left my world-class team. I'm now on my own, putting together a hodgepodge team that will hopefully get me to where I need to be. And Pete's been training nonstop. He's been winning, and he's got Matt Serra, the current champ, in his corner. So he has been focused on this career. And I show up to Vegas with $25,000 in credit card debt. They canceled my credit card as I checked into the hotel. And I'd contacted this company, Nuvasive, that did my back surgery, and I said, do you want to throw your logo on my shorts? I had your surgery. And for some reason they opted to go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
And this fight really was do or die. I'm fighting for 10,000 to show, 10,000 to win, and I'm in debt 25 grand on my credit card. So the best that I'm hoping for is that I go home $5,000 in debt. And the fight starts with me throwing a low kick, just right out the gate, just a low kick. And Pete just 1-2, and both hits land solidly on my face. And my corner said, they looked at each other and just went, oh my God, this is going to be a long night. And Pete just continues to beat the hell out of me all the first round. In the second round, he hits me with a big right hand and drops me. And all I can think is just keep the referee away from me. I've got more. Do not let him stop this fight. I jump back up. We keep fighting, and Pete throws a Superman punch, hits it square in the top of my head. And it was like the last bit of ring rust came off of me. And I just thought to myself,
now or never.
This is how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to take a beating, but I'm going to win. It wouldn't be that great of a story if I just came right out and knocked him out. It's supposed to be exactly like this. And I looked at him across the ring at the start of the third round, and I thought, if I don't win now, this is all meant for nothing. Because I spent so much on this, put so much heart into this. This has been so difficult. And I've clearly lost the first 2 rounds. If I don't finish him now, this ride ends.
Yeah.
And I ran across the ring and I hit him as hard as I possibly could and dropped him and stood above him saying, "Man, you talked a lot of trash before this fight. Do you have anything else you want to say?" And landed one more big shot and ran around the ring just screaming my head off with this emotion pouring off of me. And so I won my show money, I won my win bonus, but we also won fight of the night and I won knockout of the night. So I went
Nice.
from being $25,000 in credit card debt to having a $50,000 payday for I want to say that night, but really it was 22 months in the
Yeah, of
making
course. Yeah.
of work. And that one day allowed me to stay in the UFC, allowed me to get my sponsors. I ended up working with the company and did my back surgery for years after that. It really was life changing for my family. And then not just that, because it was such a huge story that I could have a back surgery, a spinal fusion, and return to fighting in the UFC. That I was contacted, the company Nuvasiv was contacted over and over again. My back hurts. Can you help me? What can I do? I want to get that surgery too. And I became a spokesman for people that were suffering from back pain. And
Yeah.
that one day really made the future possible for myself and my family.
And for those who haven't seen that fight, that is one of the all-time classics in the UFC. You need to go check it out. Um, Look, before I let you go, we kind of ask our guests on the MMA opinion to tell us something that we might not know about them. So is there anything that we don't know about Nate Quarry?
Boy, I don't know. I'm really
You're
an
an open book,
in
yeah.
a lot of ways. Give me a potential topic, and I'll think if I
Oh,
can think of
Jesus.
anything.
I suppose maybe childhood or something we don't know about you there.
Uh, well, most of my childhood stories are unpleasant. I guess, yeah. So, and this is well known too. I was raised in a religious cult as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was not allowed to do any sports as a kid at all. And as a kid, just my heart would break as I would see the other kids at school go out for wrestling practice or play football or something like that, and made me just really built up this anger inside of me for years and years as I saw my childhood slipping away. I couldn't fit in anywhere, being in a cult that I was too wild for, and
Yeah.
being in the world that I was obviously too tame for. And then seeing the UFC on TV when I'm 24 and just saying, you know what? I'm going to take my shot.
Yeah.
I'm going to go out. I'm going to attempt doing this and I'm going to lose everything that I've known before. I lost my family. I was disowned by my family. I haven't spoken to my mother, seen my mother in, I don't know, 9 years or so. Yeah, my family's completely fractured. Now it's myself, my little girl, my son, my wife, and her family, my in-laws that I consider my family. And I've
Yeah.
got a nephew from my brother. But really it came down to being true to myself
Yeah.
and wanting to follow my passion and being willing to sacrifice everything else and being raised on conditional love, which later I found out means approval. Well, if you do what we tell you to do, if you follow this religion, then we'll approve of you. But if at any point you decide not to, we're going to completely disown you.
Yeah.
Well, that's not love. So I had to come to terms with that and realize, my happiness is just as important, if not more important, than making other people happy by living by their set of standards. And it was always by being true to myself, by finding that freedom and quitting my job at 30 in construction to really take a shot at this MMA thing. I think the most I'd ever been paid was $500 fighting in small shows. But I saw my father die that year at 62, and I went with him to pick up his final paycheck. And
Yeah.
I just said, I'm not going to go out like that. I
Yeah.
would rather fail on the grandest scale than live this quiet life of desperation where I always wonder what if. And I kissed my father goodbye. He died a few days later. I'd spent the last 3 weeks of his life with him, helping prepare for his passing. And then I had to tell my mother, I've contracted to take a fight on the East Coast months ago.
Yeah.
I have to go fulfill this obligation. So I kissed my father goodbye and flew out to Richmond, Virginia. I got word that my father had died while I was cutting weight. And then the very next day, I was fighting and took out all of that aggression, all of the emotion that I'd been bottling up on my opponent, who, as usual, is 4 inches taller than me, had 3 times as many fights as I had.
Yeah.
But I got a hold of his arm in the first round and snapped it.
Mm.
And that was the fight where Joe Silva was in the crowd. And came up to me and said, "All right, we're going to call you for the Ultimate Fighter." And I think back to those times over and over again, and I consider myself to be incredibly lucky for where I'm at. But along with that luck meant preparation, meant that I was doing my part. While I was there with my father as he was dying, I was 3 hour drive away from my team. So
Yeah.
I couldn't work out with them. I couldn't train MMA. All I could do is lift weights and run and visualize. And that's what I did. I took my responsibilities seriously, and always just made my reality as real to me as possible. My visions for my reality as real as possible, I should say. And I think all too often we give up when someone tells us who we're supposed to be or how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to be. And in reality, if you don't believe in yourself, no one will. Because
Definitely. Yeah.
all too often you have people out there that as they get older, they get more and more bitter because every one of their dreams has failed. And then it hurts them to see you being successful because then it reminds them how great they could have been. So for me, it was believing in myself regardless. People used to laugh when I said, I'm going to do sports
Yeah.
because I was not an athlete. I was a nerdy, scrawny little kid who loved comic books, who never played sports. All I had was heart, and I
Yeah.
could take a punch. And that was enough for me to pursue my dreams.
Yeah, look, I suppose looking back at that, it probably did sculpt you into the fighter that you were with your toughness and that aggression that you showed when you were in the cage. Look, we massively appreciate you coming on and sharing your story with us, Nate. I wish you the best, obviously, with the comic book series and with the antitrust going forward. Like I say, I really appreciate you opening up. Is there anyone you want to give a shout out to before you go?
Well, just everybody that's always taken care of me throughout the years. The fans, of course, who've always been watching the fights and cheering me on. And without you, this ride would be very difficult. You need fighters, you need fans. Promoters kind of get in the way of all that
Yeah.
stuff. And then, of course, the team that has always been around me, my coaches that stuck by me, Greg Thompson, Jeremy Wires, Dan Burke, Mr. Leonard Trigg. I could sit down and write out a list of all the things that I've overcome throughout my whole life. And on the other side of the paper would be how many times somebody stood up and wanted to help me at those times, whether it was people that would just say, "Hey, I believe in you. I want to give you some cash to help you buy food for this week," or a coach like my coach Greg Thompson saying, "I'm going to be here for you and I'm going to corner you and I'm going to work with you." Or one of my most touching moments was my coach Leonard Trigg, who's my boxing coach, most sought after man in Oregon for boxing. And we started working together right after the Rich Franklin fight. And he said, "Oh, I believe I can help you. What can you afford?" And with tears in my eyes, I had to say, "Coach, this is embarrassing. I can afford $20 an hour to train with you, and I'm ashamed to say it."
Yeah.
And so he said, "Oh, that's fine. Until you get back on your feet, we'll work on 20 bucks an hour." And that lasted for, I think, about a month, maybe two, before Mr. Trigg came in and said, "Sir, Mr. Quarry, until you start fighting again, I'm not going to be taking any money from you because I want to see you succeed. I want to see you chase down your dreams." And to this day, it's the kindness from people like that, from training partners, from coaches, from fans, from supporters, that really made this ride so much better than the misery that it was would have been so much worse without them.
Of course. And again, look, I'm going to give another little plug for you there, zombiecagefighter.com. And we massively appreciate you coming on, Nate. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.